Welcome back to the channel, Hobby1 Kenobi here. In this video, I will begin working on the 1/48 scale Sepecat Jaguar by Airfix. Before I begin with this video, I just wanted to give a quick plug to one of my favorite hobby shops, Burbank House of Hobbies. To be clear, Burbank House of Hobbies is not a sponsor, and I am in no way affiliated with the hobby shop. I am, however, an online customer, and I have had many great interactions with the store. If you are looking for another place to purchase your kits and hobby supplies, please give them a try. Okay, back to the video. This will be my very first Airfix kit. This kit was released this year, and I received it as a gift for Father's Day. I have a real interest in subjects from Desert Storm, and I knew I would build the Desert Pink version. The first sprue I came across held the fuselage. It was very small, and looking further, it's clear that this set does not require such a large box. I don't know why the company made this choice, perhaps they had their own reasons. For each sprue tree, I like to attach a piece of blue painter's tape with a silver pin marked with the corresponding letter. This makes it a bit easier for me to find parts. Going through the instructions, I decided to carefully label each step and cross out any step I would need to skip. Finally, it was time to start cutting the cockpit parts from the tree. I clipped away and sanded any excess flash. The pieces fit nicely and had well-defined details. I painted the interior pieces Tamiya NATO Black. Tamiya NATO Black is actually a very dark gray, and I chose this color rather than true black, so that I could create depth and shadows with an oil wash. Once dried, the wash was removed with Q-tips. kit is supplied with decals for the forward control panel and the side control columns. I opted to only use the decal for the control panel and simply paint the switches on the control columns. The decal for the control panel is a bit delicate, and I would recommend slicing it in 2 halves to make it easier to position the dials. At this moment, I would like to remind you to like this video if you are enjoying this content. And if you haven't already, please do hit the subscribe button. Okay, back to the model. You will see here that the nose gear well bay is painted black. This area should in fact be a greenish yellow, similar to zinc chromate. However, the instructions incorrectly said this area should be black. I will adjust this later on. The main gear wheel well are each built up with a 5-sided box. The fit was great and the boxes slid into their area without issue. A panel was placed at the bottom of the aircraft at the engine area. This went on easily, however I forgot to add a piece from the inside and had to cut it away, then reattach it. Airfix provided a jig for the intakes, which came as 2 pieces. This jig was meant to ensure that the pieces aligned well, but I found that the jig was not necessary and ended up not really using it. I appreciate that the model company tried to find a way to make the buildup easier, but I didn't find proper alignment of these pieces was particularly difficult. A shim was needed between the intake and the fuselage. Some shaving was required to ensure the intake was the proper level to the fuselage. Strangely, the seams from the intakes actually ran through some of the larger panels. I decided to fill these seams and enhance where the seams should actually have been. I suspect this would be easily missed by many modelers. Next, the wings were added to the fuselage. One of the interesting elements to this aircraft is the placement of the Sidewinder racks, which are unconventionally placed on the top of the wings. Ostensibly, this was done to allow greater payload below the wings. While I did plan to install the Sidewinder rails, I decided I would leave the actual missiles off. Unfortunately, the Airfix rails were rather crude and not at all what the real thing looked like. I searched in my stash of spare pieces and found a few sets of Sidewinder rails from a previously built Kinetic Harrier kit. These rails had the proper detail and were a step above the Airfix ones. I decided to remove the Airfix rails from their attachment pylon with a saw. The new racks fit perfectly and immediately added to the overall look of this model. And with that, much of the construction is complete. Now I am continuing work on the 1/48th scale Sepecat Jaguar by Airfix. On aircraft models, I like to thin the edge of trailing flaps. These should be quite thin, but because of the limitations of injection molding, even modern kit companies make this area too thick. I usually start by shaving large amounts of plastic away with an X-Acto knife. Most of the material gets scraped away from the edge, so you will need to remove enough from further toward to the wing so that the flap does not become round. Sanding sticks are then used to further work down the material. Once most of the body was ready for painting, it was time to mask the canopy and windshield. For this process, I like to use strips and squares of Tamiya tape. I recommend always removing the edges of the tape. The only way to guarantee that the edge of the tape is straight is if you cut it yourself. The white tape you see here is a tape used for curved surfaces. Using this tape along the front and the rear of the canopy allows for the slight curvature that occurs because of its U-shape. Another thing I like to watch out for, even in modern kits, is to see if there's a long molding line along the fuselage. This kit, unfortunately, has one on both sides of the model. This should get scraped away with a blade and any detail loss should be replaced. At this moment, I would like to remind you to like this video if you are enjoying this content. And if you haven't already, please do hit that subscribe button. Okay, back to the model. Now the model was ready for the base exterior color. The color is known as Desert Pink. I compared many references to what I thought was a good median color that represented the aircraft accurately. These are typically found underneath the wing where it meets the fuselage, the space between the intakes and the fuselage, and the pylons. I find that if I concentrate on the harder to reach areas first, I am less likely to miss these areas. The easy to see flatter surfaces typically will take care of themselves. Looking at other builds of this aircraft online and otherwise, I found a great range of color, many of which strayed too far away from the pinkish tone and leaned heavily in the tan range. This is unfortunate to see, and I wonder if we modelers sometimes have an aversion to pink on our models, or if we are relying too heavily on a paint manufacturer's idea of the color. Either way, I knew I would have to mix and match to get what I see in the photographs I've collected of British aircraft in Desert Storm. After testing many times, the following colors gave me the best result. 2 milliliters of XF59, known as Desert Yellow, 8 milliliters of XF2, which is white, and about 15 drops of XF7 red, transferred with a toothpick. Good coverage was achieved with 2 coats. Next, I masked off the nose gear wheel well, which was improperly stated as flat black in the instructions. My references revealed that this area was a mix of green and yellow, closely resembling zinc chromate. Again, I began targeting the corners and crevices of the wheel wells. It is important to place the model on a lazy Susan so the model can be swiveled easily. I also made sure to hold the airbrush at varying angles to ensure good coverage. I found some references that showed the zinc chromate to be more yellow than green, while other references showed a heavier green tone. I ended up mixing 2 parts yellow and 1 part green. Once I finished airbrushing, I got to enjoy one of my favorite moments of model building, the mask removal and reveal. Lastly, I decided to break up the monotony of the single-tone paint job by lightly spraying a more heavily thinned and slightly lightened desert pink. This was applied with the airbrush, and I targeted various panels on the aircraft. When building aircraft models, I usually save the ejection seat for later. Since I like to put extra detail into them, it's better to wait so I don't slow down progress on the rest of the build. One of my favorite fixes for ejection molded seats is to thin out the sidewalls. This is done by scraping the plastic away with a scalpel. Here you can see the left side is thinner than the right. Next, I clipped away the ejection handle. This will be replaced later. Thinning the walls results in a large space between the cushions and the walls. Now the cushion and other portions of the frame will be needed to be rebuilt. Now it's time to create the mini seat belts. These are made from Tamiya tape and photo-etched belt buckles. Here is the seat all finished up. Next, I primed the ejection seat with black primer from a spray can and started brush painting the details. For this kind of brush painting, I like to use Vallejo Model Color acrylic paints. These paints mix well and have a slightly longer drying time than Tamiya paints, which makes them useful for blending. The only drawback is that they are easily removed from the surface if you need to handle the part. Next, I masked up the ECM pod and sprayed the black sections. I absolutely love ECM pods and put them on any models when I get a chance. Now the model and various parts were ready for a gloss coat. I am now using the Tamiya Gloss Clear exclusively on models. After spraying the gloss, I realized I needed to paint on a false canopy on the underside of the aircraft. Despite having a few books on this aircraft, I wasn't able to find a clear picture of what the false canopy actually looked like. I decided to take an educated guess, masked off the area, then shot Tamiya NATO Black. Now the model was ready for decals. The kit came with many decals, but only one set that represented an aircraft evolved in the Gulf War. This aircraft was named Buster Gonad and had nose art with a man carrying, well, large gonads in a wheelbarrow. Though nose art like this is funny and probably quite therapeutic for the pilots involved in war, I couldn't picture myself showing the finished model to my 3 young children and being proud of it. I decided to order a set of aftermarket decals from Model Alliance Aviation Workshop Publications Limited. This decal set had 12 different sets of decals, all representing an aircraft from the Gulf War. I chose the decals for the avid Guardian reader. I found that the crew had disdain for that particular newspaper and decided to mock it. Also, it was one of the few that didn't feature a half-naked woman, Johnny Fart Pants, or gonads. The decals laid down nicely, only needing a small amount of decal setting solution. If you are not a fan of decals, this is the model for you. Next, the model received another coat of gloss to cover the decals and protect them from the upcoming oil wash. For washes, I use Winsor & Newton Artist Oil Paints. For this aircraft, I decided to use black and white and burnt umber to create a very dark gray with a slightly brown tone to it. The paint is thinned with turpenoid. The wash is applied to any rivets and crevices. At this moment, I would like to remind you to push that like button if you're enjoying this content. And if you haven't already, please do hit that subscribe button. Okay, back to the model. As you apply the wash, you might start to notice that some areas on parts need thinner washes to allow the paint to flow around things like details. Sometimes it's best to have thicker paint so the pigment stays in place. Once the wash is dried, it is removed from the surfaces with Q-tips. I recommend stocking up on Q-tips. You will use these up fast. With the wash removed, I sprayed the model and parts with Tamiya Flat Clear. Next, I removed the mask from the cockpit and started to pull the tape off the windscreen and canopy. Any paint that found its way through the tape was pushed away with a toothpick. I gave the clear parts a quick buffing with the Dremel tool. The kit comes with FOD covers. However, the aircraft had two different types of covers, a set with a hard shell and a set that was essentially a large cushion. Most of my references showed the cushion-style covers being used at bases during the Gulf War. Another difference with these types of FOD covers was that the hard kind sat flush inside the intake, while the cushion style stuck out just a little bit. I decided to cover the hard shell style covers provided in the kit with Magic Sculpt. Once dried, I painted them red and pressed them into the model intakes. The engine exhausts were painted separately then pressed into position. No glue was needed. Next, I placed the wheel struts into the wells. They fit well, but I did have to fuss with them just a little bit. I found that the Gulf War Jaguars were painted in the desert pink scheme mere days before they left for the Middle East. I have seen many photos showing the fuel tanks with a fair amount of paint chipping off. I decided to replicate this first with oil paint supplied with a brush and a sponge. Although I could have refined this work, it wasn't quite looking the way I had hoped. I decided to use a technique called hairspray chipping to create this effect. First, I repainted the tanks in the vehicle's original paint scheme, gray and dark green. When it was dried, I sprayed the parts with a Tresemme brand hairspray. I chose a weaker compound of the hairspray so that it could more easily be removed. After the hairspray dried, I sprayed one tank the desert pink and the other a slightly lighter version of that desert pink. I wanted to make their color slightly off since they were quickly painted in the field and since the tanks would be swapped to different aircraft. I then let these dry. Finally, I applied water to the recently painted tanks and broke the brittle paint and hairspray with a scrub brush. And here is the effect. The vehicle showed a lot of wear all over, and I decided to replicate this with artist oils. I also used the oils to adjust the tone of different panels and flicked heavily thinned paint against a toothbrush to create various splatter effects. Next, I set out to create a base for the model. I started by taping off the edges. Then I coated the area with modeling paste and sanded away any imperfections. Then I airbrushed a light gray. I sprayed lighter and darker tones of the gray and various light sand colors in patches. I then mixed light brown artist oil paint and applied it in patches around the base. Then I dabbed it up with paper towels. Next, I sketched out where lines would go on the base. I used references to decide the size of the large rectangles and yellow stripes found on the airbase where these vehicles were stationed. I used a ruler and a sculpting tool to scribe into the base. I then used AK pencils to darken the lines. Finally, some spills and leaks are imitated by splattering and dropping heavily thinned artist oils on the base. It was now time to start putting many of the pieces onto the model. The windscreen was glued using PVA white glue. The tanks and ECM pods were glued using CA glue. And finally, the canopy was glued in place, and with that, the model is finished. I really enjoyed this kit and plan to build another one in the future. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this content, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps out my channel a whole lot. Well, that's it. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.